I just want to welcome everyone to today's Southeast TTRA webinar, Beyond Reporting, the Power of Everyday Stakeholder Engagement in Destination Success. And the Beyond Reporting part is very intentional. Most of us on this call or on this webinar know how to produce good research. The harder question is what happens after it's delivered, who sees it, how it's framed, and whether it actually moves the needle to anyone to actually do something. So to dig into that, we're going to have four panelists who come at this from different angles. We have two academic researchers who study how destinations functions as systems and study and theoretical background in general, and two practitioners who have to actually deal with the stakeholders on a Monday morning. I'll be honest, the fun part about this as we went through these perspectives don't always agree. And frankly, that's the point. The friction is kind of where the interesting stuff leads. So, but before we get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Joseph St. Germain. I'm the president of Downs and St. Germain Research, and I'll have everyone else on the panel give their introductions, and then we'll dive in. And I guess I want to start with Alan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Alan File, sitting in Orlando, Florida at the moment. I'm the Associate Dean at UCF Rosen College. I see some of my colleagues on the attendee list, so nice to see you folks. But relevant to here, I'm the Visit Orlando Chair at Rosen College, and I first became a DMO board member back in 2005 in the United Kingdom. So a little bit of academic and a little bit of board experience as well, but nice to be here.
Appreciate you being here. Next up, Jolly, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jolly from North Carolina, Associate Professor at East Carolina University. And I study complex systems using complex network analysis. And most of the time, I find myself studying tourism and hospitality. Using those tools, it's a great honor to be here, and it's my pleasure to be part of this panel. Thank you.
And we appreciate you being here, Jolly. Next up, can I hear from Dan?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Roberts. I lead the research function for Virginia is for Lovers. We are the state's tourism promotion authority. I've been in my role for about 5 years, and my experience bridges both the private and the public sector, mostly all centered around hospitality and tourism. I have a degree in economics, and I also grew up in Central Florida as well.
All right. And last but certainly not least, Jonathan.
Hey, I'm Jonathan Smith. I'm the Director of Research at Visit Greenville SC. I've been here for over 2 years, and prior to that, I also came from academia, not the same realm as the other two gentlemen on this call. I was actually a high school math teacher for about a decade. So it gives me, I think, maybe a little bit of a unique perspective. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of share what we're doing at Visit Greenville with everybody today.
All right, and I appreciate all the time that you folks have, and as TTRA mentioned in the comments, let us know if you have any questions. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A. But to start, I guess, Alan, when we were kind of talking through all this and setting up this webinar, you said if you really want good stakeholder relations, you have to invest time. And frankly, that's a bit underestimated in this world. Can you describe what a meaningful time investment in stakeholder engagement looks like, and maybe some of the things that commonly gets in the way?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. I think it goes back to when I first became a board member back in 2005. I think you can study destinations, you can talk to people, but until you're physically in that position, you really don't realize how complicated and how expansive the stakeholder networks are. I was in a meeting with Frida, actually, for an experience Kiss Me earlier this week, talking with a destination in Washington State, a budget of $3.7 million, so a very, very small destination. He had 48 different partners on his board. So that's a small destination with, limited provision, 48 separate partners. So I think it goes to show that understanding the dynamics of all these different stakeholders, what their needs are over time, because these things are fluid. Destinations change, Joseph, and the boards change, but really understanding how complex they are and how you have to invest time. We're very lucky. So we're right in the center. UCF's right in the center of Orlando. We're surrounded by world-class stakeholders. If we don't invest time in them, they don't invest time in us. So I think one of the mistakes that people make, just because you're got close proximity to a stakeholder, does not mean to say that you're going to have a good relationship. So it's like any partnership. You've got to invest time, effort, and actually be very intentional in terms of that relationship.
No, I totally agree. It's so vital. And I guess, Jonathan, I know stakeholder relations are part of things in Greenville. I guess what are your thoughts on creating these good relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the two most important words that Alan said when he just spoke is we and time, right? So we need to invest the time in the different stakeholder relationships because if we just look at the person that's in charge of the organization as the one to uphold those relationships and speak to each of the different stakeholders, then you're losing a lot of opportunity with that. And it shouldn't just be the work of the CEO or the president or executive director, whatever that title is. It shouldn't just be the role of leadership to have those connections with our different stakeholders, whether they be residents, politicians, local hoteliers, so on and so forth. But it should be everybody in the organization, right? Because you could have somebody that just joined and maybe they're in a manager position and maybe they can join a board for a local some kind of hospitality event, like some signature event that comes into your market every year. Having someone on the board that's younger and kind of building up as the generations grow older and they come into those leadership positions is really important, just to make sure that you've got each of those key stakeholders connected to your organization in a way that just one person and their bandwidth wouldn't be able to manage. So at Visit Greenville, we're definitely much an advocate that everybody is a part of advocacy, and it's not just a part of leadership's responsibility to make those relationships and uphold them.
Yeah, and advocacy, it sounds like that's an effort that everyone on the team needs to get involved with, whether they're a researcher or whoever it is, because it's kind of a team effort. And I know, Dan, I know you have some similar things in Virginia, but they're all different. But what say you on stakeholder relations?
Absolutely. And I think researchers especially should be involved in advocacy, right? And Jonathan and I delivered a presentation back in February at Marketing Outlook Forum, basically just making the case for research as a service or a core product of what a DMO produces, right? Research can serve as advocacy, data can serve as advocacy and building trust with your local stakeholder group and everything too. So I think oftentimes as researchers, like I know I'm most comfortable when I'm behind a computer monitor and I've got spreadsheets up and I'm trying to solve something and work my way through it, right? And trying to find the perfect answer that's going to unlock, what we're working through. But you've really got to spend time with the business, with your folks internally and externally, learning what their problems are, how can you fit into that problem set, but also just learning what the reality of the world looks like outside of the walls of your organization too. So, what does when you're looking at hotel occupancy that's 85% on a weekend, what does that actually look like out in the market, right? Because you've got to be able to relate this data and these figures and these numbers to the reality on the ground.
No, and you pulled on a string that we're going to pull on more in a little while, but it's important to understand their perspectives because they're all coming from a different place, and that doesn't mean just because it's different, it doesn't mean it's wrong. And Jolly, I know in our first time around, you kind of mentioned like building relationships is a time-consuming effort, but like from a systems perspective, it might be worth it. So I guess what's your thoughts on these stakeholder relations?
Yeah, exactly. So just related to what Alan and Jonathan were talking about, the time aspect of it and time investment is a huge part of it because from a network perspective, building a network is a very time-consuming activity. We are dealing with global information around the destination, but from action perspective, we are very much local. We are only connected to few around us. So, and it's a very continuous process, like we call it rewiring in network science, meaning that every new links that are being added, new relationships that are being created, and some older ones, some existing ones are being completely dissolved. And it's not just rewiring part, but new players coming in, new stakeholders showing up and joining to the network, and then some others removing themselves. So this entire dynamics that I just explained is a very time-consuming part, and this evolution is critical to be studied.
Yeah, and it's I know Alan a little bit ago he said it's constantly changing, but to kind of what Jolly alluded to there, it's not just a 9 to 5 thing, kind of, is it?
No, it's never ending. And I think Jolly is right. You may have a very stable stakeholder organization, but the people within that organizations change constantly. So a lot of the time, I think a lot of the time you feel you're not getting anywhere because you're going to the same events, you're saying the same thing, but the people are changing constantly. But just over time, I think that relationship really pays off. And I think the lesson is never take anyone or any organization for granted. because just because they're there, they may be there for a purpose that is not necessarily relevant to you this week, but it may be relevant the week after. So it's really, Joseph, you're probably spending about 80% of the time that doesn't necessarily give you a direct benefit at the time, but it will do as long as you're persistent. So I think persistent and patience are really, really important here.
No, I agree. And I think one of the things that you just mentioned, because these things are constantly changing, what might feel like I'm saying this for the 100th time, but for like someone in that room, it's for the first time. And I think that's something that researchers, we all have to kind of consider as we go through these. So I'm going to shift to our next question. I know, Dan, when we previously talked, you talked about stakeholders almost like different marketing audiences and creating a map to be intentional to reaching out to these people, because we've kind of talked about they're constantly changing, but by having you seem to have a system. So what does your stakeholder map look like for a destination, and how does it shape how you share your data?
Sure. So, a stakeholder map is basically like a framework or a mental map that you can use to basically understand and calculate how much time and attention you want to give different stakeholder audiences, right? So as marketers, right, we have different audiences that get different sets of tactics, right? So maybe the close-in audience to Virginia gets a different set of tactics than the far-away audience that knows less about the state, right? So we serve them different products and things like that. It's the exact same thing with stakeholder management. A stakeholder map, basically, you would plot everybody, along kind of like an XY axis, to get a little bit technical about it, of power and influence. And then from there, you will understand how much time and attention do I need to be serving these different individuals, right? Somebody with a lot of power and influence is going to need a lot of very curated, customized time with them, right? And letting them be a part of the process, versus somebody who doesn't have a lot of power and influence. Maybe you just check in on them or keep them informed, right? You can use like a RACI chart is a very similar concept as well, but it just helps you prioritize different stakeholders and honestly customize the treatment that you're providing each one.
Yeah, and it sounds like, theoretically you want to treat them all equally, but the reality is it's just not going to work that way. And I guess, Jonathan, I know you're dealing with stakeholders as well. What's your response to this stakeholder map?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dan kind of hit the nail on the head, is that it's really important to understand what they need, what they find of value, what they understand about your DMO, right? Or your organization, whatever that may be. Because as a leadership team, we've spent time sitting down and saying, okay, we have each of these key stakeholder groups. And again, we ask ourselves those questions. So like, what do they find important? Like, what is valuable to them as an individual? What do they believe we do for them? What do they believe about tourism? And then what are some friction points? Then how can we address those friction points, right? Because it would be really easy just to create like one huge data packet and just share it out with everybody, right? But that's not what everybody needs, right? And that you certainly don't want to give that to everybody, because you could have people drawing incorrect conclusions based off of what they've seen, what they've shared. Or you could have people that try to dig through the data and pull out malicious data points that they could use maybe against your organization, right? Take things out of context, or not provide the appropriate context to explain what that looks like and what the value of it is. So yeah, no, understanding who the stakeholders are is really important, so that you can speak to each of them in the most appropriate way possible.
No, that makes sense, and I'd love that from the practitioner side. I want to go to academics. Like, I'll go to Alan. Alan, what's your thoughts on this from a theoretical perspective?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, Joseph, because a lot of the European work on destinations is very much about the fluidity of destinations. So there's no defined geographic space. The whole thing sort of moves with visitor flow. And what that means is your stakeholders will change and the priorities will change. And in any destination, you could have a new attraction, and all of a sudden the balance of visitation shifts to the north, to the south, to the east, or the west, depending on where it is. And that tends to change the dynamic with the stakeholders. And I think one interesting one in our space in Central Florida is actually the public school network, or here it's OCPS, Orange County Public Schools. And you might think, well, what's the relevance of them? Well, as a labor force for the destination, so it's different to the visitor, but we have a labor crisis here. There's not enough people to come and work in the industry. So all of a sudden, students in middle schools and high schools are a major focal point. So all of a sudden the education leaders become an important stakeholder, albeit for the labor rather than visitation. So these things change constantly, but it goes back to the mapping from Dan. Once you've got that map, it's like a jelly. It moves, and it's keeping track of the movement and understanding the dynamics as it changes.
And I appreciate that. And Jolly, I know when we first had this conversation, you kind of mentioned like intentional mapping matters systematically, and that was fascinating. So could you share with our audience like why this matters theoretically?
Sure. So actually, I can add a new dimension to this because I believe that that's basically what we do. We map the systems using networks, and that's the area I'm specialized in. Maps are important. In any system, mapping is critical because we identify the structure, and that structure can be actually very fluid structure, and just what Alan was explaining. And using that map, we can critically monitor the system's evolution, scaling, growth, and all those stuff. Also, we can find, for example, structural holes that are essential for innovation, moving around the network and things like that. But not limited to that, we can find the opposite of that, or local clustering, which is critical for the resilience of the system and robustness of the system, what we know as a support system, stakeholders that are closer to our area, that are going to act as our supporting system, especially in time of crisis. So it's extremely important to have a good conceptual map of the system. And there we can use methods such as network science to map it.
Now that's interesting. From the sounds of it, you're by nature you're going to have some folks who are going to default to supporting you, but you have some others who may detract a little bit. And this reminds me as I listen to all of you, something I say at our office a lot is you kind of know your audience, and I even joke with the team, you have to speak different languages. If I'm speaking to a politician versus a stakeholder versus a resident, data might be the same, but we have to frame it in a different way, in a way that they understand it. Because I think it's so important for us research folks to meet them on their playing field as opposed to the vice versa. And that's actually my long-winded segue into, Jonathan, you mentioned, there's a risk of sharing data without context because sometimes it's taken out of context, and stakeholders in some cases can walk away with incorrect assumptions, or in the example that you mentioned, like they could use it against you in some ways. So how do you decide who to share, and what's that line between tailoring your message to an audience without compromising the objectivity of data?
Right, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's important to do exercise. It's kind of like what I mentioned before, right? Understand who are your stakeholders, what do they find important, what do they need, and tailoring the messages appropriately based off of those stakeholders, right? So we've got, just for example, we've got several different like packets, if you want to call them that we'll send out to each of these different stakeholder groups. So we've got like monthly packets that go to our board of directors. We've got quarterly packets that might go to our members or some of our hotel partners. And like based off of the audience that's receiving that information, it's either more or less expansive, right? So for each of these, we provide insights either in the email prefacing all of the charts and information and data that almost serve as an appendix to support the insights that we've provided. And then for the stakeholders that might be further removed from the tourism, from the hotel travel industry, if they're appropriate to receive that data, like some of our members might work in retail or some kind of experience, they might not know what an ADR is, right? So in the packet we send out, in addition to the insights and what are the so whats, what are the takeaways, we include a glossary just defining what each of the definitions are, right? So if somebody doesn't look at a chart and sees that like, oh, occupancy is down whatever percent without understanding the context, it's like, okay, well, that's because we're comparing to this event, right? Or it's because we had an increase in supply, which is lowering our occupancy, right? Because just my experience from being a high school math teacher, right? You've got to be able to explain complex topics in a simple way, right? If you can't explain difficult topics or complex topics in an easy way, then you probably don't understand it that well yourself, right? And then when you get even further away and you're talking to the media, give them like as little as possible, right? You don't want to give them more than 2 or 3 data points because they will probably inadvertently mix it up, right? So it's just really important to know who the audience is. Do they need more information, or do they just need to know the key takeaways. And out of those key takeaways, what's going to relate to them the most, right? Because I know that, especially over this past calendar year, or I guess this calendar year 24, maybe, we found that we had a data point that's like $2.5 billion in economic stimulus came from visitors, right? It's like, okay, $2.5 billion to us. Like, is there any difference between $2.5 billion and $4.3 billion? Not to me, right? Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. But if you take that and you break it down on like a daily level, what's the daily impact each of the businesses in our destination see? Well, that's $6.8 million every day, right? So that's a lot easier to grasp and to understand. So having the data available is really good. It's helpful, but make it so that it's the data points that they need to know, have an elevator pitch if necessary for each of those different audiences, for sure.
No, that's such a good example. Again, just speaking, we need to make sure that they understand what we're talking about, because these big numbers with the bees, it's just a massive thing. So and Dan, I know you have some similar thoughts from your work in Virginia.
Absolutely. I think we just work as a team so hard on simplicity, right? Like it's a cornerstone. Like this is kind of goofy, but like I have like a sheet of core values that I created for our team when I first joined 5 years ago. And one of them says how we translate information is just as important as the information we produce. Like we have to keep things, there's an art to simplicity, and simplicity is very hard because I think in our nature as research and data and numbers people, we love the complex. We're addicted to it. The more complex, the better, right? The more sophisticated a solution is, the more powerful we think it is. And I think that's important absolutely for solving issues that are really deep. But oftentimes, like just putting that simple hat on and working in the other direction is the hardest part of this job. Like creating the little legislative flyer that we hand out on Capitol Hill during the legislative session is just getting that from the data down to something that makes sense to a legislator when you have 5 seconds of their time is one of the hardest things that we do. So I just think being really intentional about being simple and then practicing it, honestly, making it a core function of your team, of your research team to think about, is this understandable? We have all this information accessible. Oftentimes we have enough information to answer the questions that are coming in. It's about how it's being translated and how it's being presented and in order for it to gain traction.
No, I think that's such an important point. Like there's so many ways for communication to break down, whether it's intentional or unintentional. The easier understandable you can make it, and translating it in a way is vital. I guess, Alan, what's the thought from the academic side?
Well, it's not really an academic response, but it's a response to what Jonathan said, because I got caught out by a Canadian reporter earlier this week on exactly the issue you raise. And the question so many destinations are asking at the moment is about the Soccer World Cup, which is coming in the summer. And because ticket sales are a little bit patchy, there's a lot of negativity. So essentially, the reporter is very much wanting any material or any evidence to support his narrative of negativity. My comment was essentially, and it goes back to the issue of context, a soccer fan is not like a normal visitor. It's very, very different. And many fans will behave at the very last minute, depending on how their team progresses. Are they doing well? Are they not doing so well? So it was one of those cases where, yes, you try and bring it down to a simplistic level, but one slip that can be twisted very easily to fit a narrative, which suits the journalist. It doesn't bother me. I'm 3,000 miles away, whatever. But it just really reminds you of how careful you have to be with the facts and how you explain what, in many cases, quite big differences. You simplify it. If you simplify it too much, it can be twisted otherwise. So it's always a pretty delicate balance, particularly on a subject which for many cities at the moment is very, very sensitive. So yeah, caution is the word.
No, for sure. And you mentioned, like with the reporter there, you mentioned it's like a psychological construct of like confirmation bias. They're going to attend to the things that are kind of that aligns with the narrative they currently have. So it makes this important. And Jolly, what's your perspective on sharing data with context?
Mainly just summarizing what's mentioned so far and just reiterating one of the points. So basically, it boils down to two things. First, appropriate handling of the data, and second, appropriate contextualization. The point that I wanted to reiterate is what Jonathan explained correctly, that simplicity is always preferred. And that's if you can simplify something, it's much easier to understand. It's usually they take the scope of the solution and data much longer distances. But what I really want to reiterate, what Dan mentioned, that it's all about the problem. Sometimes simple solutions for complex problem even make it worse. So we should look at the problem, and obviously we prefer simple solutions, but we should also take care of the problem itself. We should be very cautious, as Alan said.
No, that's great. And it was interesting there that we actually had the practitioners and academics specifically saying, I agree, which is probably going to change with this next question. But
before we get into that question,
yeah.
I just want to say it's a win that Jolly said I explained something correctly. So
Hey.
I'm just throwing that out to make sure that we recorded that.
Yeah. And as Maria said in the chat, contextualized simplicity is the vibe. I like that. I like that summary, Maria. So, but Jolly, I want to go into your research, but your research is suggesting overall, and this is one of the ones we're going to have where we had some not disagreement, but just different viewpoints of. Your research suggests that DMO is acting as the center of all connections within the tourism community, can actually reduce network resilience. And then I know, and we'll kind of kick it back between the academics and practitioners. But can you help us understand, like, I know there's a couple different models, but like why that may be the case?
Sure. So yeah, basically we have we have many, but two of the broadest model we have in this area is that we have a star configuration, also known as a nucleus model, that simply says DMO is in the center of everything. Everything goes through DMO, the data, information, everything basically. And the other one is the decentralized model, which is DMO only takes the role of facilitator among other players just to create basically this relationships, help the players to create those relationships. Both models have their own goods and bads. Basically, for the nucleus one, it's very efficient. It's from cost perspective, especially, that's very efficient model. But the problem is it's not very resilient. It's a very vulnerable model. So from resiliency perspective and from robustness perspective, the decentralized model is more robust. Also, I believe it matched better, and this is a personal opinion, it matched better to the nature of the industry we have, which we even cannot really call it a single industry. It's more of a phenomenon. So, and that's the main reason that I usually favor the decentralized models for DMO, unlike Jonathan, that I'm hoping to hear his perspective as well.
Yeah, Jonathan, I know you have your model in Greenville. Can you explain what works for you folks?
Yeah, so something I do really like that Jolly said is that tourism isn't an industry; it's more of a phenomenon. Like I really like that a lot. Like Jolly, I've told people that like over the past like 2 weeks since you mentioned that the first time. I really like that explanation of tourism. But at Visit Greenville, we do kind of prescribe more to that nucleus model because if people know that we are kind of the authority on tourism, then they'll come to us when they have questions, right? They know that we have a lot of the answers for them. And then part of the caution that I think that Jolly and Alan probably would point out, rightfully so, is that if you are seen as the organization taking credit for all of tourism, well, that's wrong. Like you can't do that because it's not true, right? Because like the $2.5 billion in Greenville spending by visitors, we did not cause all of that. But by us being the nucleus and people knowing that we are kind of the authority on the phenomenon of tourism, means that we can kind of help guide and steer the destination in ways that will best benefit ultimately the residents, right? Because if you don't have a guiding force in your destination that's steering things in the right direction, that have the best outlook, best perspective, however you want to put it, for the residents, for the community as a whole, then you could end up in a really bad situation where it's just you have a lot of some specific industry that could potentially collapse, right? And that's not where you want to be. And a really good example of having a seat at the table and maybe not necessarily being a driving force in this one, but continuing to steer it in the way that it needs to go would be like my background here, right? So this is downtown Greenville. This is Falls Park right here. We've got a little river coming through downtown. And over 2 decades ago, this wasn't here, right? The waterfall was, but it was a 4-lane bridge of cars just driving it over it all the time. And people didn't know that there was a waterfall there. So with Visit Greenville's influence and the mayor obviously having support of it, they took down that bridge. They bought it, received it, accepted it, whatever the right verbiage is for that, from the state, tore it down, and then built this pedestrian bridge here. And now that's a huge economic stimulus for our area. It creates a large reason for people to come to Greenville and come to our downtown area. It's just kind of the beautification of this. And if we were not, if tourism could have happened without us at the table, then this potentially wouldn't have occurred, which would have been a huge loss of economic development opportunities for our destination. Our residents ultimately would have not received nearly as much benefit as they did from this initiative.
No, I appreciate that example, Jonathan. And Alan, I want to go back. Well, I want to go academic practitioner on this one. So what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, my perspective on this is I always refer to the DMO as the fluid glue that keeps everything connected, but it's fluid. And if I give an Orlando example, obviously, every destination is different. Everyone has slightly different agendas. But in this destination, you've got two major players. You have Disney and Universal. They can operate on their own. They don't need a DMO. But the area benefits because Visit Orlando or Experience Kiss Me Down the Road, their job is to glue all the small players together, all the medium-sized players together, and leverage maximum benefit for everybody. And that's particularly true of the residents. Without the DMO, you don't get that. But the DMO has to be very fluid and adjust to the demands of certainly of your big players. And I think one of the big fluid shifts in the past few years, I've lived here for 14 years, all of a sudden, downtown Orlando is now a destination in its own right because it's got the sporting venues. And sport is a very, very big part of business here. That wasn't the case 10 or 12 years ago. So the DMO is moving. It's got to be agile and it's got to reflect the changing dynamics of the destination. So as I say, to me, it's the fluidity of the glue, the stickiness, which is really, really important.
No, I know Jonathan mentioned he like Jolly saying phenomenon. The fluid glue of tourism and DMOs is one of my favorites from the discussions that we've had on this. No, but I think it's such an important point because it's this constantly changing construct that we need to adapt to. And Dan, I guess I want to get your perspective on this discussion.
Yeah, and well, first off, I just want to say, like, I really missed out on pro soccer in downtown Orlando because I left Orlando in 2009. And Alan's totally right. I think how that's evolved and things like that. For us, just to give you all a little bit of background, like Virginia, we're an old state. We have 133 localities or basically counties. And we like I think from Jolly's point of view around how there's this like the two different approaches, right? The centralized or the decentralized approach. I think we kind of incorporate the best of both of those in terms of how we work, especially as to how we share data, right? So as I mentioned, we have 133 localities, and there's like a very long tail of localities if you were thinking about them from a point of view of like visitor spend, right? We have a lot of smaller localities with maybe a tourism office that has 1 or 2 people in it, or maybe the tourism office is half a position shared with economic development or something like that. But for us and how we push data out and keep everyone informed, we actually have, in addition to like having a large marketing team here in Richmond, we also have what we call a partnership marketing team, right? And our destination development team lives underneath that umbrella, but they actually live in the markets that they serve, and they're kind of sprinkled throughout the Commonwealth. And those folks are actually the power users of the data that we're pushing out. Like, so we subscribe to Symphony with tourism economics, as many folks on here do, but I'm actually not the core user of that. My job is just to keep that running and to make sure it's up to date and accurate. Our destination development team are in there daily pulling easy to use information out of it around economic impact, visitation, hotel performance, and things like that. But they're pulling it and it's customized for all those different localities and they're bringing it to meetings with them, right? So we're using that, the data is centralized in terms of, who's maintaining it and who's owning it. But the way that the data is being shared out is decentralized. It's being shared with local context by people who are familiar with the market and who know the market and who have built trust. in the local market as a source of authority. And Jonathan, I just want to mention one last thing here. Jonathan mentioned about kind of that balance between being the authority of on something and taking credit for it. I do think there's a huge distinction there where DMOs can be the authority of performance, of trajectory around the market and things like that. We can be the centralized voice on that, but there's a distinction there that he absolutely spoke well to around not taking credit necessarily for that.
No, I think that's a vital point, and I think I'm glad you both brought that up because I think there is a distinction that some folks may not understand all the time, and I just want to appreciate this conversation because I got to have it like 3 times with you folks, and I've learned something new every time, and I appreciate that, and I guess that's one of the things if you're on this call and you're not a TTRA member or a SETTRA member, like that's kind of the point of this organization to bring these two different groups together to have these conversations. And so, anyways, I had to say that out loud as the SETTRA president. So it's like I'm required by law, but I do think it is like it really brings to life like what this organization can do. It helps us better understand because I think it's been just interesting hearing both sides. So um, with that, I'm going to move us from like this is what we do now to let's kind of look ahead in the future. And Alan, I know you'd mentioned a variety of things with Orlando's economic partnership, and I know it's like it's brought tourism and agriculture and military and tech and sports into a shared conversation, but sometimes with unexpected outcomes, not in a bad way, but just not unexpected. So, what does it take as we're the DMO is this fluid glue? What's it take to build these cross-sector relationships that is becoming, frankly, a part of the DMO's job description?
Yeah, and you know, Jose, I'm actually going to refer to, I think it was from Frida asked a question about government authority, and I think it's relevant here. And I stress, obviously, every single destination is different. So, you know, I think when you hear an answer or solution to one destination, it's not necessarily applicable elsewhere. But I think one of the changing dynamics in Orlando or the greater Central Florida area is this increasing attention to the needs of the resident and the resident community and the different types of resident communities. And we're all well versed in the benefits of tourism, but I think sometimes those benefits haven't always been accurately communicated to the residents and, to be fair, the politicians. We're very, very lucky at a city and a county level across most of Central Florida. We've got a very, very, very supportive political base, irrespective of their blue or red. They essentially understand. But I think the pressure point is constantly you've got to ensure that you're delivering benefits to the resident community. And I think the current marketing campaign for Visit Orlando and the OEP, the Orlando Economic Partnership, is unbelievably real. And it really is a strong call across industry to, it's not just a nice place to visit, but actually it's a good place to live, it's a good place to invest, and it's a good place to study. So if you're going in that direction, you have to have everybody on board. And, you know, I go back to what I said about the education group earlier, so Orange County Public Schools. If you're moving to an area and if you're a parent, the single biggest thing that you ask is, what are the schools like? So you can't exclude the schools from a broader tourism and economic development message. So it's really, really important. So here it's working well and it's really, really diverse. But I think the political will is here because they understand tourism ultimately drives so much of the economy. So you can play around at the edges, but you've got to be very protective in how you develop it and obviously how you communicate the benefits primarily to residents.
No, it's vital overall, and I guess Jolly, from a systems perspective, how does this look based upon what you know and study?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to, since this is really relevant, tie this to Frida's question. First part, second part, hopefully we can answer later. But the first part, she's asking, I should change my glasses. Can you talk more about how network bridges support information and knowledge transfer among stakeholders? So that's the part that I believe is relevant. So in network science, we have something known as a small world models. It's really easy to bond with people that are close to you. Not this closeness can be physically, like they are working in the same organization you're working, you're in the same state as they are, or it can be attitudinally, like these are the same, similarly thinking people. Also be known as birds of the feather, homophily network. This bond doesn't have any new information. And this can go also to the industry, like hoteliers get along with other hoteliers. They form this compartmentalization, that modularity, that they talk to each other, but they don't talk to anyone else. So this increased redundancy, which is good for resilience, but kills innovation. The reason is that whatever news you have, everybody else also has that. So you're connected to the people. And job of information, looking for a job, you already know what they know. Now, bridges are helpful here. Bridges are those long connections, those people you see one time a year, like from a different DMO, from far away, somebody that you only talk every couple of years. Those bring you new information. Those bring you new opportunities. Innovation can really travel from those bridges that are very expensive to build and maintain. So it's not like bond. It's not easy. So they speak different languages. They tend to be with their own modules. But then some of those people, some of those stakeholders form these long distance bridges that are extremely important for the innovation, which creates those between group type of communication.
No, that's interesting. It sounds like with those small groups, it's a lot easier to communicate because you have that shared language. But the reality is, if you want to innovate and move forward, you kind of need that diversity of background in order to make it all work. That's fascinating. And I guess Jonathan, as you do that and go through that kind of thing in Greenville, what's that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, we're pretty intentional about, again, being integrated with each of our different stakeholders. And I can also speak to kind of the first part of Frida's question here. It says, do you have dedicated task forces or four key stakeholders, or is engagement managed through more informal meetings for research insights? As a leadership team, we identify who are the stakeholders, and we might say, okay, after we've identified them, what they need, what they want, et cetera, it's like, okay, well, who already has existing relationships with these groups, with these people? So, okay, well, they should probably take ownership of that, right? Of that communication, of being on that board. And if we don't, we say, okay, well, who's best positioned, right? If we need a connection with the Malden City Council, we'll pick somebody that already lives in Malden, right? Pick somebody that's a citizen that lives in Malden. So it's not necessarily like a task force, but we do have those relationships that are built really intentionally based off of existing relationships or existing connections, kind of how Jolly mentioned with similar interests or similar backgrounds. And at Visit Greenville, we've been really intentional to incorporate our research team amongst the other economic development researchers, right? So we have meetings that are about quarterly, maybe every other month, where we meet and we talk about like what's happening in Greenville, right? Well, what are the initiatives that your organization is moving forward to? What is something that you're interested in doing? And I mean, it spurns a lot of really important conversation, and it helps us understand, again, like where's the economic development looking to head? What would be helpful for our residents? Because if we hear that, okay, hey, we're trying to invest in life sciences, like we're trying to get life sciences to build more business here, build more infrastructure, build more industry in life sciences, well, it's then, okay, well, then maybe we need to work with the airport. Maybe the airport should have a seat at the table, which they do. And maybe we should look at getting a direct flight to Boston, right? Because there's a lot of life sciences in Boston. Then if we can get to Boston, then that adds another avenue for us to market, right? That might be a new market for us to then get travelers and tourists to come here. And then it's just like that cycle that keeps growing. So working really intentionally with the economic development group is really helpful. And it's progressed to a point where we've actually been able to build out, and it's in its final stage, it's not 100% done, but to build like an economic mobility report, right? Where we compare ourselves amongst other peer cities and aspirational cities, or next tier maybe would be a better word. And it compares things like demographics, economic opportunity, economic mobility, and quality of life. And it takes into consideration what each of our different organizations value and find important. And that's really important for that kind of like shared prosperity and understanding, okay, how are we continuing to drive our destination forward in the most responsible and most efficient way possible?
No, that's great. And Dan, how do these cross-sector relationships work in Virginia?
Well, I think what's interesting about Virginia is this: we're an incredibly regionalized state. So every region is like very distinct. Northern Virginia is very professional services oriented, very government related. The government, just the federal government, has such an impact in Northern Virginia. And then their rural counties operate totally differently than everyone else as well. But I actually did a leadership development program last year where the whole point of it was exposing you to how these different regions operate and then trying to come up with some commonalities, because to get anything done in Virginia, you have to understand how these regions kind of operate interdependently and then add up to the greater whole that they are, right? So the whole point of it though wasn't just it was actually building trust. Like it was to learn how different regions have built trust between the spokes of the wheel, between one another, right? Between all the different industry functions and the different organizations, between government and private sector and things like that, because everything moves at the speed of trust, right? Whether that's for what we're doing externally or internally too. And so, and just to touch on Frida's role real quick, or Frida's question real quick as well, I think, we're not doing a lot of that dedicated task forces or anything like that. I think it's mostly folks who are closest to, the region in question, or where that stakeholder lies as well. I do think there is such thing as too many reports as well. I think what we've been really intentional about over the past couple of months on our team is actually working towards a new way of sharing data internally with the rest of the organization. So not just sharing the reports that we're getting from our market researchers or from our hotel data or anything like that, but actually taking time to slow down and kind of collate different sources together, and then add our own voice on top of that and put that in a predictable format, right? So we do these little research memos now that are like just 1 or 2 pages, so people have time to read them. But if somebody asks us for something like, hey, well, can you give me some background on outdoor recreation in Virginia? Sure, let's pull together, like we'll do a little briefing document for that rather than making a big deck or something like that. And that allows us to answer these kind of one-off questions really quickly and with some agility as well.
That's great. And I think that trust piece is so important. I think that's like it takes years to build and it can only take a day to totally collapse. And I just think that's something we intentionally, all of us as researchers, and Dan, you mentioned it, but it's just like it's such a vital part about this. So, because one of the most frustrating things, and I'm sure everyone who's done this have been like, well, when people like I just don't believe those numbers, and you're like, what? We've done I've told you everything. We could spend 30 minutes going over the methodology, but I want to just give you the information. So it's such a vital piece. And I also want to say thank you to the panelists who've been answering some of these questions. You're making my job as a moderator a little bit easier. So, we're gonna have one more question for the panel, and I'm gonna mention that. So if any other questions are coming in, and Freed, I know there's a couple other aspects of your questions that we'll get to, but if there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I guess for the panel, as I want to think forward. The stakeholder, as we've talked about, stakeholder universe is only getting bigger. Attention spans only getting smaller. But what does this effective stakeholder engagement and reporting look like about 5 to 10 years from now? And I guess, Jonathan, I want to start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the big influence on what does it look like in 5 to 10 years is going to be what's the impact of AI, right? How is that going to impact our stakeholders, how they communicate, how they learn, how they get their information? And I mean, that's a question that I don't think that any of us can really responsibly answer, right? Like, we don't know. Like, AI looks so different today than it did 2 years ago. But what's really important, I think, is to put yourself in a position to where you are staying as ahead of the curve as possible, right? Because if there's anticipations that like AI browsers might become commonplace, that AI is going to be integrated into everything, well, then invest in an AI browser, right? Like figure out how that tool works, because if it's going to be what everybody uses in the future, well, then if a destination has no idea what an AI browser is in 5 or 10 years, well, then you've lost a huge potential opportunity to advertise to potential guests to your destination. So, I mean, I guess to answer the question, like, I don't know what it's going to look like in 5 to 10 years, but I think that we can do our best to be really responsible stewards of our destination by staying in front of AI as best we can, because it's going to continue to change. There's going to be ways that it streamlines the work that we do, which allows us to potentially be more invested in our stakeholder relationships, right? And if we're not spending quite as much time building out dashboards and building reports, and if AI is able to work through that on our behalf, then I mean, take advantage of it, right? Don't sit there and just keep using an abacus when you've got a calculator sitting right beside your desk. So,
No, I agree. And Alan, you've had experience in Europe, and you're currently in Orlando, one of the tourism capitals of the world. I guess what are your thoughts on where we go from here?
You know, I'm probably going to say something very unpopular, Joseph, in the sense that I actually see government being more important in the future, partly because government fund the majority of these things. But I think the big investments or the bridges that Jolly referred to earlier, the big investments are going to require government, be it at city, county, or state level. And I think where government really comes in, Orlando is a really good example. Recently, I was thinking about this when you mentioned Boston, Jonathan. Orlando, for the first time ever, has now got direct flights from Japan and South Korea. Much of that came through government connections and government links. Was it for tourism? No, it's for the semiconductor industry and the space industry. So these are things that aren't necessarily tourism driven, but there are significant tourism benefits. So whether we like it or not, government are there and we have to work with them. And on the big ticket items, they're such an important stakeholder. So slightly different from AI, but we have to work with the politicians, whether we like it or not. And most, I must say, are actually very supportive.
No, for sure. It's yeah, I definitely hear that. Dan, what's your perspective on where we go from here?
I think it's interesting because for those that know me personally, like people know I like history and everything, right? So I've got like actually a lot of history of research files in my office right here that go back to the late 90s. And sometimes I look through them if I need some inspiration on something. But they are what strikes me is 20 years ago, the depth of questions and the depth of methodology and even the depth that and time and attention that we were spending on relatively questions of a relative narrow scope, everything was just a lot more deep and incisive, right, than it is today. And I think because I think the research function is basically transformed from that into more of like a business intelligence function, right? And so with that and the stakeholder creep, I think what we're going to need going forward is just data solutions that are very scalable, right? So how do I have a data set that I can manipulate, to answer questions for different parts of the state or for different stakeholders, but coming from the same source of truth. But honestly, too, to Jonathan's point about AI, I'm going to take maybe like a little bit of a rogue prediction here. And if everybody's kind of if AI is kind of lifting up the water for everyone, right? Like a rising tide lifts all boats, and that raises the basic kind of you know um, just familiarity of what everybody has access to. I think maybe the pendulum will swing back towards depth, right, being rewarded, right? Because that's the value that we're going to be able to add over that. Is if AI is kind of raising everybody's aptitude, that gives us an opening as researchers to kind of go back to solving issues of depth and also of just maybe that AI is not going to be a credible source for as well, or maybe collating different answers across what we're getting across multiple AI instances.
Yeah, and just to add on to the cautions of using AI, I actually saw a video of it recently, and I tried it myself. The voice version of ChatGPT. Ask it which months are spelled with the letter X, and see what response you get. I've gotten September, October, December, and February. So it's still got some work to do for sure.
No, it's getting there, but it's got some work to do. And I guess Jolly, as we move forward from the systems perspective, I just want to get your perspective on where we go from here.
Sure. So change is always the only constant in complex systems. I don't know what the future is going to look like or to what extent AI is going to be influential. What I know is we have about 15 characteristics and conditions for a complex system. Not every complex system should have all of those, but some of them are very important. I want to go with two of them. One is emergence, and the other one is basically adaptive capacity. Emergence means none of the behavior of the system can be reduced to its elements. And the adaptive capacity is the way the system learns and changes. And it doesn't need to be an intelligent system to do that. Simple mechanical feedback loops can create a very adaptive system. So it doesn't matter what 10 years from now is going to look like from my perspective, because tourism and destinations as complex systems are going to well adapt to the situation. The only thing is that those stakeholders that are not adapting are going to be eliminated. So mainly, it really doesn't matter each single element to be in line with that, the entire system. because the entire system is going to survive, and it's going to cost the single individuals who are not adapting well.
Yeah, it's a common thing in a myriad of silos. It's adapt or die, and from what it sounds like from there, Jolly. And as I've listened to everything that we heard here, and I'm going to get to you guys answered most of Frida's questions. We'll have one more here in a second, but just as the takeaways that I heard, I mean, Dan, you mentioned like it's collecting the data and understanding the data is one thing, but if you can't translate it, it doesn't matter. And to do that, like it feels from what I'm hearing, we have to meet people in their space, use their language and understand their perspectives. What do they need? What do they value? I just think that's such a vital part of this because when you're communicating, like you could do perfect research, but if someone else can't understand it or you're not looking at it from their perspective, so they didn't feel their voice was heard, they may not utilize it. And that's what we're all trying to do here. We're trying to give some feedback or give some data to help us make better decisions. So let's see. Well, I'm going to ask Jolly one other question because that's what we have. That's what we have right now. But if there's any other questions, let me know because we have a couple minutes. Because you folks did a eloquent job of incorporating some of these questions. But Jolly, Frida's other question was, when it comes to these bridges, why do you think studies on bridges aren't more common for a practitioner?
So again, my answer is going to be only from my perspective.
Yep.
Part of the story is we are from two different worlds. We speak different languages. Actually, I can only speak for myself, not for all academicians, but most of the research I do is based on pure curiosity. Yes, I might try to do some problem solving, but those are going to be problems for theoretical stuff. So the part of my papers that I love to write is the theoretical contribution. The part that I hate really to develop is the managerial implication part. On the other hand, industry people, practitioners are all about practical problem solving. So the research is totally different. A very small percentage of what we do in academia really has the utility for the industry and comes out and being employed by the practitioners. And that's the first part. The second part of the story is that we really do a bad job from traditional statistical studies perspective that are considered as very regular type of studies, communicating our findings or simplifying, as Jonathan said, simplifying things for finding some utility for them among practitioners. But then if we look at from complex system perspective, that's by itself is more complex for academician now, let alone to be able to simplify that in a level that is acceptable or likable by practitioners.
No, that's a great answer. And I don't see any other questions. We're about at our time. I really want to thank Jonathan, Dan, Alan, Jolly. Thank you so much for your time. I do mean that when I say that. It feels like every time we have this conversation, I learn something a little bit more. So I thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone on the webinar for listening in. Always feel free to reach out if you need anything. And just as TTRA said, thank you all for listening and learning with us. So we appreciate it and take care, everyone.